Hello and welcome to the second in this short series of terrain modeling in SketchUp. My name is Paul Hensey and thank you very much for joining us. Again, I would like to thank Elmtec, the UK distributors of SketchUp, for hosting today's event. Just to let you know that there are two more which are sort of a follow-on from these, which will be broadcast on Monday and Tuesday next week. And that both of those are concentrating on the use of plants in SketchUp. So trawling through things like the 3D warehouse, using 2D plants, plant symbols, how to do plant plans, and some strategies for putting together drawings relating to plants through layout. But today we're looking at terrain modeling. The previous session concentrated on looking and modeling from data sets, contours, and spot heights was the word I was looking for. And today I'm going to spend the hour looking at ways of modifying terrain. And I mentioned yesterday, it's relatively simple to create a representation of the terrain that you're trying to record, that is the site as it is before you start doing any design work. It gets a little harder when you want to start taking your design and imposing it and onto the terrain and manipulating that terrain. And I'll pick up on some of those ideas as we go. So let me just close down this screen fill. The first thing I'm going to look at is a very old technique in that it's a digital version of what you might be familiar with in architectural modeling. So if you ever see architectural models, which I think in themselves are beautiful things, the terrain is invariably, or was invariably, represented by slices. You would take each contour, trace it, cut it out of cardboard, and lay it in situ. And so you end up with what is affectionately known as a stepped terrain model, sort of like tea plantations going up a hill. And we can recreate that very easily in SketchUp. So on screen, you will notice, excuse me, I just need to get my keyboard in the right place. But you'll notice that I've got a flat contour model. It's part of the contour model that I looked at in the previous session, except this one is still in 2 dimensions. I find it useful when asking a surveyor for data. So they're going to produce the data with all of the things about the building and the levels, 3D spot heights, contours on their own layer in 3D if possible. It's also very nice to have a layer imported with contours in 2D, because sometimes you need to represent the terrain without seeing it in 3D. You need to lay it over a 2-dimensional drawing just to see where level changes occur relative to either existing features or proposed features. Doesn't really matter. You can project 3D contours back into 2D relatively simply. So here I've got some of those 2D contours, and it's not your eyesight. This is not a rectangular perimeter. It's sort of strange lines. I've created a surface from this, and I simply drew around the edges, and because all of these contours were loose geometry, they weren't grouped in any way, it's created surfaces between the contours. And the stepped terrain method is simply a case of elevating each of these along with the associated geometry. And by that, I mean you would go to the first contour, select it, drag it up, let's say 0.5. So that's a ½ meter elevation, drag up the next one, and then lift that one up, 0.5. And maybe 0.5 is quite steep. So maybe I'll go up something like 0.2. And you would simply, excuse me, lift up all of the geometry using this method. Now you'll notice that I end up with all these tiny little facets, and that's because if I select the original geometry, you can just about see highlighted that when this was brought in, if you remember from the previous session, these were very fractured lines. And I could select them and use the simplify contours or TomTom's edge tools to simplify the curves, which will reduce the number of breaks in the curve and therefore the number of polygons, these little rectangles that are created when it elevates the geometry. But I'm just going to make a few more of these. So 0.2. You might know that if you double click on a surface, then it elevates it the same amount as the last inputted dimension. But what I can't do, I can't click on these with a double click simply because I'm dragging this one up to here. And in this case, it's dragged it up a meter. And then if I double click, it will repeat that process, or as in this case, eliminate it. So you have to then manually input. I'm sure it's a quicker way of doing this. It doesn't take that long. And I'm not going to do all of them. So you get the idea. And there is my stepped terrain. It is possible to then make a selection of this and create a surface using sandbox tools or Toposhaper. However, what is useful and unique about this form of terrain modeling is the accuracy and the visibility of the surface, because you can see the individual changes of level, and you can also see the contour, which is effectively the front edge. I quite like it. It's much more workable geometry. One of the problems with terrain modeling, if you've done any, then you might appreciate, is that once you've created one of these surfaces using Toposhaper or sandbox tools, because of all of the triangulation, they are virtually impossible to manipulate. Certainly using select or standard native tools within SketchUp. You have very little control, and when you think you've achieved the change that you want, you might then realize that it's also affected other parts of the terrain or geometry that you didn't intend. Whereas this method allows you to completely control the geometry because it is using absolutely basic modeling techniques. And to illustrate, let's say we've got a bit of a bulge here, and there's something that I want to do. I want to reshape the land. Well, that would be quite difficult. It needs some very skilled work in using the sandbox tools. But what I can do here is I can pull down this geometry, and then I can draw in a new curve. So I might just use the arc tool and draw in a curve over here in a quite poor way. Oops, I didn't think it was lying flat. There we go. And then I can erase the old curve. Now I can control, obviously, the size, the length, the depth, the offset, all sorts of things about that curve. And now when I lift it by the same amount, I've got a perfectly repositioned contour. Okay, I didn't pay much attention to the transition to the adjoining geometry, but it's a way of shaving and manipulating and almost carving the landscape, but really quite specifically. I also find them quite aesthetically attractive. It's quite nice to see some fluid constructed geometry, and then it's perched on top of this very nice sliced model. And you can even take that one stage further in programs like V-Ray and Twinmotion. Probably Enscape, I don't know it, but you can make these layers almost look like they're cardboard. So you end up with, by creating a visualization that looks like an architectural model. But I find this is one of my main techniques for just keeping the terrain under control. And if I need to then do a presentation and maybe I need to do a smoothed version, I can just create using Toposhaper or using sandbox tools, a surface over this by selecting just the contours. So I hope that gives an insight into that method. Right, we're going to look at another technique. Just bring this window in. And here we go. Okay, here is a terrain. This terrain was created just by using one of the techniques I mentioned yesterday, which was bringing in an aerial image through the geolocation function in SketchUp. And really, all I've done is switch off the hidden geometry. So if I go to View Hidden Geometry, you can see it's a very even grid. So I'm just going to put that back on. But let's say that at the top of this slope is the property, and halfway down the slope they want a pond. And the ponds and slopes don't work very well, so we've got to change the terrain in order to allow the pond to sit. So we're essentially going to create a platform, which is going to involve, it could be cut and fill, or it could just be a lot of cut, and then we'll need to distribute the material elsewhere. But we're going to concentrate on how we can get the pond into the terrain. And obviously, this can apply to lots of other types of things that we put in the landscape. So on a separate piece of geometry, I've simply created a rectangle and I've drawn my very poor pond shape. So this isn't very linear. It's sort of tangential, but it's sort of organic. The outer line is really the clear, flat area that I want around the pond. What I can't do is just simply push the pond into the landscape, because I could end up with the pond very close to a change in level, which would possibly cause a problem. So I'm just being prudent and saying it'd be nice to have a flat area around the pond, and then anything outside this area can start to slope up or can start to slope down. So you can decide what that shape is. And all I've done is just draw the shape. It's not using any offset tools or anything. It's just a visual approximate distance. And to give you an idea, it's approximately 3 meters. So how do we do this? Right, I've separated out the geometry. Here, I've deleted the surrounding rectangle that I used as a plane to draw my pond on. And this is my pond geometry, and this is my platform surround geometry. And then I've copied this geometry up or down, doesn't really make a difference. And then I've removed the pond. I've drawn a line across, filled in, and then erased all of my pond geometry. Because what I want to do is I want to do this in 2 stages. I want to create the flat platform. And once I've got the flat platform, then I'm going to push the pond into the platform. I could do it in one go, but I sort of think that it may behave better if I do it in 2 stages. Also, I've got more control over the geometry. If I don't like it, then I'm only editing 1 stage. And as I mentioned previously, I always make copies as I progress, so that one, I can see the process that I followed, and if it fails, I can visually go back and check and maybe try a different process. And I've also got the ability to go to the previous stage and grab the geometry and bring it back in and edit it if I need to make any changes. So here we go. this is what we're going to create. So this is just an idea of what we're going to do, and I'm going to do it on this model here. I'm going to use the sandbox tools, so I'm just going to bring those in. Sandbox tools are a set of 7 icons, and the one that you'll use the most is the first one, which is from contours. But we're going to use this one called stamp, which I think is the middle one. Pick your geometry, which in this case is my flat platform outer perimeter of my pond. What you'll notice is I have positioned my pond where I want it to be. So it's hovering over, because this activity that we're about to do is based on up down. It doesn't work side to side. It's not like push pull. You can do it in any direction. It only works in the up down direction. So if I go to my plan view and I switch off perspective, you'll see that I have positioned my pond where I think it's best located. And I can just move these around if I want to. So I can just pick that geometry and move it backwards and forwards. But we'll leave it where it is. So I'm going to pick my platform geometry. And then I'm going to go to my stamp tool, which is the little house hovering above a terrain. And the first thing you might notice is my pond has got a little red line around it. And that's called the offset. And in the bottom right-hand corner of my screen, and when you do this in your screen, it's telling me what the offset. So when it starts to push and stretch the surrounding geometry, it will do it within the perimeter of that red line. And it remembers the last time you did this. So the last time I did it, it was 0.3 meters, which is very tight. So I'm going to change this to, let's see what 2 meters looks like. 2 meters, maybe we'll go 3.5. So maybe that's something better. And you'll see the effect of this. And it might be that when you do it, it doesn't look right. So you have to then go through the process again. And then once I've typed in 3.5, I get the little stamp icon on my mouse. And it's, as I bring it over terrain or a piece of geometry, you don't have to do this on terrain. It's a way of stamping geometry into other shapes. But underneath is my terrain. So it's activating it, it's going blue. If I now click on that geometry, it's now just doing the processing. And there we go. It's actively pushing, it either brings the land up or pushes the land down. Now, there's a little trick to get a side view. And it doesn't help that I've got all of these other bits and pieces around me, but I'm going to get a side, because when I bring my mouse down, I'm trying to make sure that I don't have too much of a rise at the front of the pond and too much of a cut at the back. So I don't mind a little rise. What I don't want is a really serious change of level, because in this case, if there's a problem with the pond, it's all going to go downhill. So I want as much supporting material. So maybe I'm going to go somewhere about here. It's a bit of an art. You could put in some reference geometry in advance so that you know that you're the position that you're aiming for, but you simply click to place, and there we go. What we've done is into. Now that's the platform. So here we've got that geometry, and then this surrounding line is obviously that offset. And it's a reasonable cut at the back, and it's quite a nice slope at the front. So the next stage is to take the pond, and I'm going to do exactly the same. Whoops. I'm going to select my pond, and then I have to not just pick the surface, but pick the perimeter, and then I'm going to hit the drape. And I've got an offset on this, and I'm going to say 0. I don't want this one to offset, and then I'm going to push this one into here. This is quite a big terrain, so it's just doing the thinking, and then I can, whoops, here we go, decide how much of an offset I want. So that will then push into the terrain. Now, oops, there is an alternative method to this, which is, because of the way I'm constructing this pond, I don't necessarily need to do the drape. I can just take this geometry and then I can move it into position. So if I just need a vertical reference line, which I'm going to pick from here. I'm from the edge of a, whoops, pond on the wrong version, onto here. And then I can take a copy of this and I can take it from here and it will snap to the intersection. And then I can simply push this down. So it has the same effect, because at this stage, what I want is a vertical sided pond. If I'd wanted a slightly tapered sided pond, then I could have used the geometry with an offset. But for the purposes of this, I actually want a vertical sided pond, because I want to have control over the profile of this pond. So at the moment, I've got a pond. It's a bit unrepresentative, because what I actually want is achieve this. So I want to create a stepped pond. So this is going to be a marginal shelf and an internal lower marginal shelf, and this means that the pond's a bit safer. Somebody could get out of it if they fell in, but it also gives me different zones for plants. So in order to that, just going to go back to the previous one. What I can do is start to draw in my profile. So this is just a plane that I've created, and all I'm drawing is, I can draw in whatever shape I want. But we'll keep it as just being, in this case, a marginal shelf and then a gentle slope to the bottom of the pool. And what I'm going to do now is use one of the basic techniques in SketchUp. So I've just made my large tool set, which is the Follow Me tool. What I want to do is drive this profile around the perimeter of the pond. I don't need to pick every single profile line individually. If I double click on a surface, it always picks a surface plus the perimeter geometry that creates that surface. And then if I hold the Shift key, I can deselect the surface. So in 2 clicks, I've picked what would have taken me 20 or 30 clicks. So that's my path. If I pick the geometry, the Follow Me tool, and then hit the profile, it will drive that profile, and there is my pond. Now, because this is rather a unusual shape, it doesn't have particularly smooth transitions, it's got some very tight curves, this can happen. And this is where the geometry is turning through a curve so tight that you can hear the tires squeal, and you end up with these patches. I'm hoping that this geometry will give me the volume of water and therefore the volume of material that is excavated for its creation. But in order to do that, I can ask it for surface areas, and under my entity info, it's telling me, but it's not giving me a volume. You only get a volume when it's a closed solid. So I need to be able to create a pure piece of geometry that doesn't have any holes in it. So I need to patch up this. So if I go to View Hidden Geometry or Show Hidden Geometry, I can see that there's a gap and that it hasn't quite filled in one of these quads, one of these rectangular forms. I'm also going to switch on the X-ray mode, and I can see that there's, as the geometry's gone around the corner, it's sort of twisted and folded on itself. So what I'm going to do is erase some of these lines. They're just in the background. Also, I've noticed that when I select this geometry, it is not actually, it has created it. It just caused this one to reverse. So if I reverse that face back, I probably have a clean piece of geometry. This one has just given me a solid line, not a dotted line. So if I use the Erase tool and hold down the Shift key and drag across, that's the same as using the hide command. Now, I'm just going to view, show hidden geometry and switch it off. If I draw a line across my pond between any two edges, and I switch back away from X-ray mode, it closes up my shape. So I'm going to select my surface and I'm going to say make group. And hey presto, my pond, I'll just lift it out of the ground for you so you can see, is now missing pieces of geometry. And I know that because if I go to my entity info, it tells me it's a solid, and it also tells me the volume, and it doesn't give the volume unless it is an absolute closed solid. The other thing to do is a very neat little extension. If I go to Tools, it's called Solid Inspector by, you've guessed it, TomTom. And I'll just bring that over, and it tells me there are no errors, everything is shiny. If there are errors, they're listed, and there is a semi-automatic fix all. It will try and fix gaps and eliminate odd stray lines if they're present. But this one's clean, so that's why it's giving me a volume. Oops, there we go. So that is a neat way of getting a cut and fill, because now I can tell somebody that in order to excavate this, you're going to be removing 21 to 22 meters cubed of material. The other thing it's quite useful for is on things like ponds and features, you can then work out the volume, which will then help determine the value of things like pumps and filters and power requirements and how frequently you want to turn over the water. So there's a version of this I haven't corrected. It's a bit more of a complicated shape. What I wanted to now talk about is it's a little bit more controlled, because when you're pushing into the landscape, you don't have that much say. And if I switched on hidden geometry, you can see the actual geometry that SketchUp has created when it's forced this shape in, and you really wouldn't stand a hope of manipulating that if you wanted to make any adjustments. If you didn't like that feature or didn't like where it was, it would probably be easier to go back to the beginning, move your original geometry and go through the process again for the 5 minutes it takes, because to try and change that can be very problematic. So let me just go back up here. So a good example might be simplistic like this, that here's a house at the top of the slope. Here is the new terrace that I want to create with a flight of steps and a lower terrace so that they can sit here and look across the valley or whatever this slope represents. But what we want to do is move this into the landscape and then change the landscape so that it flows around the geometry, which is requires quite a lot of manipulation. But fortunately, there is a plugin, an extension that will allow us to do that. And a good example is here. So I've just taken that geometry and I've pushed it into the landscape, into the position that I want it to go. I've just switched off my contours for this. It just makes it easy to see the geometry. Now, I've done something to this in advance, and I'll just show you, which is I've made all of my property or everything into a single group. So if I had some walls and an extension or another path or another set of steps, I would make them all into a group. The next stage is to create a perimeter or a ground line. And by that, I mean, I'm just going to use the line tool. I'm drawing over the existing group, and I'm just drawing where I want the ground to be around this geometry. So I might want the ground to come to this point, and then I want it to be quite close to the step risers, and then maybe just come up here, and you simply draw around your geometry. And go all the way around. It doesn't have to be horizontal. I could put a big bump in the back if I wanted to. And then I think that goes to the front there. So you just draw that round, you select all of that geometry, and then you make it into a group. So select that geometry, and then make only the perimeter, make it into a group. And that's what I've done here. So I've done exactly that, and then I've just pushed. So there's my perimeter group, and there's my property, or my essential hard landscaped elements of the garden. So I'm simply going to pick the perimeter, and then I'm going to pick an extension, and it's by somebody called Valley Architects. So Chuck Valley. He has a presence on the extension warehouse, but when you come to investigate these, you get taken out of the warehouse to his own website, and he has lots of really nice, succinct YouTube videos that explain the process. They're also really useful if you don't use these very often to go back and remind yourself. These are paid for plugins, and I think they're about, on average, about $15, and you subscribe to them, so it's a $15 a year. But as you can see here, I've got the instant terrain, instant site grader, instant fence and railing. If I need a wall, I'll go and download his plugin and pay the $15, because pretty much all of them are worth it. They will save you huge amounts of effort. So I'm going to use the instant site grader, and we're going to grade around a loop or an object. And oops, sorry, it's just opened up off screen, and here is the little interface. So I'm going to pick the well, it's used lines, so I don't really need to do anything. It's just going to use the lines that I've created, and I'm just going to go with the grade. So I'm not changing anything on this, and I've just picked grade. Oops, I'll try that again. So I'm going to pick that and that, run the extension. Okay, that's better. It's now doing something. And there we go, it's done it. Now, within the parameters, which I just went with the defaults, one of the parameters was how much of an offset do you want? So in the same way that the drape command asks you for an offset, I think the default is about 3 meters. I think it's 10 feet. So I've just gone with the default. And it recolors itself. But what you can see is if I change the color to the general base color, that the ground has been altered to match your geometry. And I can't emphasize how much of an effort that is. It's really neat. It's really clean. However, if you then change your design, your client says, well, wouldn't it be great if we could have a landing, or let's go up a bit and change direction, go back and start again, which is one of the reasons why I would suggest you keep these stages, because I can go back to this stage, change my steps, and then just run it again. And it really doesn't take that much time, and you end up with a much cleaner model. You end up with a whole series of versions as well. So instant site grader, Chuck Valley, really useful. Now, this one, probably, yeah, there are lots of plugins, lots of extensions, and one of the things you can't do is just open it and expect it to run. So you have to practice with these, and they don't always work the way you think they will. So things like Toposhaper and SiteGrader look relatively simple, but they can be quite complex. There are usually lots and lots of settings involved. So if you're going to use these extensions, then just set up some little test models and just learn what they do. There are lots of tutorials on YouTube. So Justin Geis at the SketchUp Essentials and Tutorials Up are both really excellent sites for just demonstrating how individual plugins work. And both of them have covered terrain plugins. Here I'm just going to look at a retaining wall, and I want to regrade the land around it. So I want to regrade at the back of the wall, but I want to obviously, keep the ground up, maybe make some slight alterations at the front. And the Chuck Valley grader plugin does handle this to some extent. It's not absolutely perfect, but it's probably the best way that you're going to be able to do this. So I'm going to pick my object and my terrain. I'm going to go to the site grader, and I'm going to grade around the object. And it's changed. It recognizes this is an object, not a line. So I'm going to go to Styles, and it's opened up this little window. And it recognizes that this is more like a wall than a building. So I've got a whole load of options here. It helps if you understand what these icons mean. But for instance, if I hover over this, I get the little label pops up called L top, which means level the top. If I pick the next one, it says L top bot, which stands for level the top and the bottom. So let's go with that one. And then I can close my style. I've got a whole load of parameters in here. How wide do I want the offset to be? So, I could type 6 meters, and we'll probably go with that. And off it goes and does something. And there we go. That's the 6 meter offset. And there is, and it's leveled out the top. To some extent, it's done its best. And then it's done a fair job of leveling out the bottom as well. So what there needs, and one of the nice things about this plugin is that Chuck Valley has appreciated that you sometimes need to have an intersection. So if I go back to the plugin and go to SiteGrader, there's something called smooth terrain. And it's a really simple tool. I'm going to go with the default, but I want to flatten verticals. So I just go with the default, and you end up with a circle. And if you click, what it does is it picks the terrain geometry, not the object geometry, underneath your mouse, and it levels it. So you can see it's making a better transition around the corner. And what we've got here is a little bit of a slope. So if I click this area, it's trying to make it level as best as it can. And then I'm just going to give it a better transition around the corner, and then maybe try and lower. And that's probably the best I'm going to get, which is actually not bad. Obviously, these are in the landscape. You could try and, so then maybe I'm just going to color that, and that's what we get. So it works really well for standalone geometry as well as these closed shapes. Okay, so I'm just going to pull that down, and I'm going to bring in sort of the last technique that I'm going to really have a chance to cover. I can only do so much in an hour, and there are lots of ways of doing terrain. But these are the primary ones. These are the ones that work very effectively. And this one is really useful. And this is a way of patching terrain. We'll get to the patching part, but we'll just deal with creating some interesting shapes. Here I've just literally drawn this jelly bean shaped piece of geometry. This could be a pond, or it could be a grass island. And you could just drag this up and paint it grass. So, nothing complex about that. But you could do something else. And you could do something like this. You could make a dome of this shape. So essentially, you're creating a closed piece of terrain. You don't really have much say about things. I'm just going to put in a little reference line maybe here, and then maybe I'm just going to draw a little circle. Maybe I'll just reference it the same way I did on my previous ones. So I'm just going to maybe make 1/2 black, 1/2 white. And then I'm just going to pick that, make it into a group, and then move it into position. And I'm going to raise that up, I don't know, let's say 0.45. Let's say that's approximately the height that I want my dome to be. So that's just a reference that will help me. I don't really have the ability to set that. But if I want to create this as a dome, I'm simply need to open up an extension called Soapskin Bubble, which is this little set here. I think this is one of those icon sets. It's free. I think there's a paid for version. I don't know what extra you get with the paid for version, but I think it claims that it only works with SketchUp up to SketchUp in 2019. I'm using SketchUp 20 and it works perfectly well. So it's always worth giving these things a go. I pick the surface and its perimeter. So a double click, and then I hit the skin button. And it puts a grid in place. And this grid is just arbitrary. You'll see shortly. But at the moment, it's giving me a default division of 10. And that's just the starting point. That is, no matter how big the space, it will always give you the starting point of 10. So I'm going to refine it. Don't refine it. Don't put 50 in, because you'll end up with a terrain with so many polygons that it will slow the computer down. So I'm going to say maybe 15. Now I've typed 15, and instead of pressing return, you have to double tap the return. So tap, tap. If you don't, then it somehow doesn't work. And I only worked that out not so long ago, because I used to use this a long time ago. It's become a bit more refined, but this double tap, I don't know if it's an operating system or something, but it seems to solve the problem. So now I've got a grid, and it's been grouped. So there's my group. If I now select my group and then go to the bub or the bubble part of the toolbar, it's asking me in the bottom right-hand corner of my screen for a pressure, which is what it's going to do is it's taking this as a skin and it's going to apply an air pressure. Now, you may not see anything happening, because depending on the way you've drawn your geometry, the pressure could be positive or negative to go up. So sometimes it pushes it down even though you've typed a positive pressure. So if I type in, I'm going to start with 10 and hit return, well, I can tell immediately that that's gone down. So I'm going to retype with -10. I don't need to reiterate the whole process. I just need to type in -10, and then this happens. And I really like that little animation of it inflating. And it's way above my target up there. So I'm going to maybe type in -5 and see what we get. Maybe it's still a bit much, so -3. -3 is not far off. I could type -3.25. So we're quite close. So you can see just putting in a reference gives you a means of, giving you a target to aim for. It is also that grid that you generated becomes the grid of the space. If I switch on hidden geometry, you'll see that we end up with all of these triangles, but it's a really even mesh. So it responds well to doing other things to it afterwards. So I'm just going to switch off hidden geometry. And then I can just simply give it a color. It's a group, so you need to open it if you then want to start playing around and making cuts or pushing and pulling into it. If I want to do a pond, obviously I can push it in as I did before and then push a profile around. But a way of doing a pond might also be to do the opposite of this, which is if I run the skin bubble and then I'll just type in 20 just to show you what happens. Double enter. Select my mesh, run the bubble, and I'm going to say, in this case, I'm going to say 15, and that's pushed it into the ground. I don't need this surface anymore, so there is my pond. And I could then push a profile around here, or I can take that and move it. Whoops. I can move it down into the ground and give it a vertical surface if I wanted to do that. So there's all kinds of things, but that's a very useful little plugin for doing incidental pieces of geometry. But it's also really useful for doing sort of patching geometry. And here's a good example that sometimes when you're designing things, you are given all the constraints and you don't really have much say. You could, here's the front of a house. We could put a door here. We've got a path. But the actual ground line of the house, let's say the door is going to be about here. So that's our geometry. That's the roadside. We've got 2 walls. Well, you just need to create a garden. And maybe the only job you can do on a project like this is you're doing the planting. You might want to terrace it, but let's keep it simple. You're going to work with the land as it's been provided. So you just need to create something that patches into this space. So best way to do it is create some small profile lines. Try that again, using the arc tool this time. I'm going to give it a very slight camber. So that's flat. So that's just got a camber. And I think the same on the other side. I'm going to use the arc tool, drag it down, give it a very slight lift. And then I'm just going to pick all of this geometry. And you might remember from the first in this series, this is exactly what we did when we were creating the shoebox. We were just picking our perimeter geometry and then we would use the sandbox tool. Except I'm not going to use the sandbox tool. I'm going to use soap skin. So I've picked my geometry. It's closed. It is certainly not planar. And if I click, I'm going to type in, I don't know, a grid of 15. Double tap. And immediately it stretches itself and fits. And I think that's a fair solution. I'd be quite happy with that. But I'm the process. So what I can do now is perhaps pick my grid. I'm going to hit the bubble. And then I'm just going to give it a pressure, but a really low pressure. I don't want this to be a big bulging space. So maybe I'm going to give this -3. -3 is too much, -1.5. So maybe -1. So it's just got something a little bit more, but I think I probably preferred the original version. So that's a nice way of just creating infill geometry or patch geometry. Here's another one. I might just create an arc from these 2 points. Pick all of my perimeter. In fact, I can't pick that because I need to slope my geometry from here to here. Try again. So I don't need that line, I need that line. So just pick the perimeter and now run the tool again. I'm just going to put in a division of 20, and there it just stretched itself to fit. But if I want to inflate that ever so slightly, pick my grid, pick the bubble, and then maybe apply a pressure of something like -1, maybe a bit more. This one, because this one is very, the skin is constrained because the perimeter is very close to it. So even though I've typed in -3, it hasn't inflated it that much. So maybe it's going to be more like -7. I mentioned yesterday that sometimes you end up with these different colors. This surface here is gray. If I reverse it, it's white. And it doesn't usually have a consequence for basic modeling, but here it does have a consequence because the blue face is usually the interior or the down face. So that's why I'm having to type in minus, because it's usually, if that would have been white, I would be typing in a positive. Now, what we've got is a door with a pathway. So underneath here is my drawn pathway. So I can now modify this terrain, this patch, by pushing in some path geometry. So here's a rectangle. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to just move this rectangle, which is a copy of this rectangle. I've just extended it out at the end a little bit. And I'm going to move this into position. This is just a flat horizontal rectangle. So I'm going to put that. Let's get it approximately. There we go, in the right location. I'm just going to pick the center point of my rectangle, the center point of the door. So they're aligned. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to hide this geometry, and I'm going to move this down. I'm just going to switch on my X-ray, and I'm going to move this down so that it's outside of the door. And then all of the projection that I've been showing has been horizontal. All the pond geometry and the bit that I was pushing into the slope was horizontal, but it doesn't need to be horizontal. If I rotate this path, so if I go to my rotate tool and I just use my keys to get the right angle, if I now pick the end, whoops, try that again. Right. I'm just going to slope the path into position, and then I'm going to move my path out of the way, or I could even move a copy of it, but maybe I might put that on its own layer. I might keep that as a construction reference so that should something go wrong or I need to make a modification, but just in this case I'm going to get rid of it. And then I'm going to unhide my piece of terrain, and I'm going to project, I'm going to drape this into this. So I'm going to pick this geometry and I'm going to then drape. Do I want it to have an offset? So maybe I'm going to pick something like 0.1. What does that look like? Maybe something like 0.2. So we'll see what that does. And then I'm going to pick this terrain, and I'm just aiming, if I look at the door, I'm aiming to get the path so that it's level with the front door, or maybe it's a little bit below. But I'm just going to go with the path at the front door, and then I'm just going to click. And so that has now pushed a nice flat plane into my terrain model. And then I can pick this terrain model, and I mentioned that we can use the soft and smooth edges. And it just takes a little bit of playing around with the various settings until you get the one that you want. So if you want a sharp cut, and maybe I'll just go with that at the moment, and then you just give that a color. Whoops. Don't need to give everything the same color. And I'm just going to go to View, Hidden Geometry, and now I should be able to pick individual elements. And I can then just start to give these, oops, it's made it all green again. Anyway, you get the idea. That's just me needing to just separate the geometry, and it's just got a gap down here. So this is pretty clean, except I'm just would have to trim this down, and I've just looked at the time and I don't really have time to show that, but that is just causing these two surfaces to become unified, so that when I pick one, it picks them all. So that would just need me to delete that off. But as principle on I hope that that shows some of the main options. Amongst them, that really covers a lot of the main techniques, the ones that are repeatable and that you can have in your head when you think you've got a problem that needs solving. There are other methods, but most of them do revolve around things like soap bubble and using the stamp tool. Any questions?
Oh, hi, let's have a look. We've got a question here from Sam Proctor. Hi, Sam. He is asking, was that the drape tool you used to push the path into the terrain on the last demo? And what if you wanted the path to simply follow the terrain? Hope that makes sense.
Okay. Yes, you're quite right. Sometimes you don't want the path to be absolutely planar. You just want a path to follow the ground. So I did use the drape tool, the stamp tool to push it in. I'm not sure how successful I can be, but if I roll back this model, here we go. If I now take this geometry and instead of stamping it, I drape it. So I go back to the sandbox tool. There's a little, almost looks like a halo over a piece of terrain. It's like a circle. If I take that icon, which is the drape tool, pick my geometry and then pick the drape tool, it then asks me which terrain I want, which is the one that is underneath it. And you can see that it is draped that geometry into the terrain. And that has now split the terrain so that I can, apply my gray paint. And that doesn't need to be linear. That could be a curving path. So it's quite a nice way of draping a path that you want to be gravel or bark or grass that goes up a slope.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. I hope that answered your question, Sam. Got a good question here from Ivan. Hi, Ivan. He's asking, is there a free and good alternative to SiteGrader and Surface Flatter from Valley Arch?
And what was the last part of that question?
Is there a free and good alternative to SiteGrader and Surface Flatter from Valley Arch?
And Flatter. I'm not quite sure I understand the last part of the question. Valley Architecture, or Valley Arch, makes the SiteGrader. Is there an alternative? No is the answer. I would love to hear if there's an alternative, but I don't think $15 is much to pay for something that actually is very robust, works. The other thing that's really nice about paid plugins is that the developer maintains them because they have a vested interest in keeping a small revenue stream going, which means they are usually updated with the latest versions of SketchUp very, very quickly. Problem is, some of these plugins are great, but they're not maintained and they're free, and people move on, and some of the great ones are no longer around because they don't work with the latest version of SketchUp. So
yeah, it's a good point for the paid ones. So Ivan just said he's understood, and I don't know, I think you've answered that, but he mentioned there was a tool to flat the surface which you used around.
There was a smooth tool. Sorry, yes, there was a smooth flattening tool, and that comes with the SiteGrader. So it's not a separate tool, it's not a free tool, but it is a tool that specifically works with SiteGrader.
Okay, yeah, great, thank you, Ivan. I think that looks to be, oh no, that's not a question, but that's from Louisa saying excellent webinar. Thanks, Paul. Thanks. Glad that you're finding these webinars really helpful. It's great that we're getting this positive feedback. Yeah, I don't think we'll give it maybe 1 minute and see if any questions. If there are any questions, feel free to email either myself, that's Lauren at Elmtec, with a SketchUp distributor in the United Kingdom and Ireland. You can also contact Paul. Yeah, I think we're done with questions, but yeah, if anything else comes to mind, feel free to reach out. Oh, someone's asking, how can I find these webinars on YouTube? Okay, so we are recording all these webinars, and they are going to be uploaded to Elmtec YouTube channel. You can either search that for yourself next week, or if you've signed up for the webinars, we will send out an email next week directing you to them. So all 4 of Paul's webinars will be available on YouTube, and that's the Elmtec channel. As explained, Elmtec is the SketchUp distributor in UK and Ireland. Yeah, so Alexandra, hi Alexandra, she's saying, can you please list the extensions you used for the terrains, please? So I think, Paul, you will, what we'll do on YouTube, Paul did a series for us about 2 months ago, and you'll find in the comments section in YouTube, Paul will upload links to any extensions and plugins that have been used, just so that you know where to get them from. I think that's right, isn't it, Paul?
Yes, most of these plugins are free. I think the Valley Architects are the only ones you pay for. So
yeah, so most of them are free, but yeah, there's some that will be paid for. But Paul will sort of do a crib sheet and we'll upload it to the YouTube, and you can find, I think you just click on more underneath the comments section underneath the YouTube channel, and you can see if you prefer to get the information via text, then that'll be there. If you wanted to sign up for the rest of the series, you can go to Elmtec's SketchUp website and look under our events page. You can just Google that, or you can contact me, whichever you prefer, whatever is easiest. And I think that is it for the questions. Yeah, so yeah, thanks, Paul.
okay, my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Really looking forward to the plants one. Really looking forward to that on Monday, and then the second one on Tuesday. It's going to be brilliant. yeah, so wishing everyone a really lovely weekend, and thank you for taking time out of your schedule. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you very much indeed.
Bye, everyone.